So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the intersection of sport and speaking, or speaking in the context of sport. Let's look at some of the key concepts we're going to look at here. First, I want to begin by contrasting the medium of speaking with the medium of writing and how that affects language. And then I'm going to look at four different elements of speaking, of speech events within the larger notion of sport. I'm going to look at sport announcer talk or commentary, trash talk, motivational talk, and self-talk or private talk. Speaking can be distinguished from writing on one particular basic level in terms of how speaking is ephemeral or transient. You're hearing my voice now and it's gone. Of course, I am recording it, which gives it a certain amount of permanence, but for the most part, if you think of spoken conversation, it is gone. It disappears. Thank goodness in many ways. As we know, social media is making permanent a lot of the things that we write, and it makes it very hard to get rid of. So writing has become increasingly permanent. Some words to distinguish between the two. Instead of talking about speaking and writing, we can talk about oralty and orate cultures. As opposed to literacy and literate cultures. In fever pitch, um, 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 a distinction is made in the growth of Nick's support for Arsenal as he goes from being a person who is involved in the orate culture of being a fan to becoming the part of the literate culture of reading intellectuals like Brian Glanville. That's a picture of a very famous sports writer in Britain. I was an intellectual now, and Brian Glanville's pieces in the Sunday Times had taught me that intellectuals were obliged to watch football for its art rather than its soul. And so we have lots, of course, of instances these days of blogs. Grantland, for example, which is devoted to longer pieces, which are very much part of literate view of sport. Let's look at some of the difference between speech and writing then. As we said, to begin with, that speech is transient and writing is permanent. Of course, as we'll see, and as you probably have realized already, that all those text messages, which are of course are written, which have, well, sound like spoken language, of course, can be very permanent. The second difference is what we call the additive or rhapsodic nature of speech. That is, it tends to be a series of simple sentences joined by an and. Here's an example, and this is especially true of a narrative. I was riding my bike with my dad and my little sister, and I was going down a hill awfully fast, and I hit a manhole, and I went over my handlebars, and I fell right on top of my head and landed on the left side of my face. So it's a repetition of very simple sentences conjoined by and. This is the notion of being rhapsodic or additive. As opposed to writing, of course, as we'll see, which uses lots of subordinate clauses and is very hierarchical in its particular structure, sentence structure. Three is the way that speaking, far more than writing, uses formulaic expressions. We call this aggregative. Here's an example. Have you heard? Heard what? The news. What news? I got it. Got what? A phone. Cool. Okay. So it's adding on. We call these adjacency pairs. So have you heard? Heard what? So by saying "Have you heard?" it triggers that particular response. In many ways, this is what we call phatic communion, which is a kind of a fancy way of talking about the use of language not to convey information, but just to maintain social relationships. Every time you greet somebody, that's an example of phatic communion, phatic communication. And it's interesting that you might greet somebody the first time at 9 o'clock in Gaudy Hall, and then you might see them later at 11 o'clock, you still have to greet them. And if you see them later at 3 o'clock, you still have to greet them. If you don't greet them, the other person will think, what's the matter with him? So phatic communion or communication is a very important of language. It maintains social relationships. A fourth difference is that speech is very redundant, it's copious, it's full of lots of repetitions. We kind of express our ideas several times over. This is part of the negotiation of meaning. It's very difficult to capture what we want to say in real time in a perfect utterance. When we're writing, of course, we have time to think and to edit, but when we're speaking, we use a lot of redundancy. Again, this is an example from Nick Hornby's Fever Pitch, and I've used this before, but notice the repetition here. You're a disgrace, Gould. He's a disgrace. 100 quid a week. 100 quid a week. They should give that to me for watching you. So there's repetition there, and if you look at any piece of spoken language, you'll see lots and lots of redundancy. 5. To contrast with speaking, because we have time to edit, writing is grammatically compact and lexically dense. So things like restrictive relative clauses and indirect questions are pretty common in written language, but very uncommon in spoken language. We just don't have the time to be able to put these very complex phrases into a spurt of speech. We tend to speak in bursts of no more than 14 words or so. It's very hard cognitively to construct these in your head while you're speaking. But when you're writing, of course, you can do this. So, for example, here's an example of a restrictive relative clause. The rules developed here have environmental constraints that are important to some speakers but not applicable for others. And indirect questions. It's important to ask whether a given theory deals only with the kinds of cognitive skills that children acquire normally. That complex grammar and use of dense vocabulary is a feature of written rather than spoken language. Another difference is that speaking tends to be people-centered and writing is topic-centered. We can talk about speaking as being involving ego involvement, and that refers to the use of a lot of personal pronouns like I, you, we. So ego involvement with yourself, I mean, involvement with the hearer, I mean, you should do that. Written language tends to be more detached. Often you get a use of passives to avoid mention of particular personal pronouns. So here's an example. Thus, the styles of the participants can only be judged as they surfaced in interaction with these participants. No I's and U's here. In fact, there's a studied avoidance of them. So there's a picture of Al Pacino doing his famous halftime speech in the movie Any Given Sunday. And we'll be looking at that later when we look at motivational talk. A seventh and final distinction I want to make here between speaking and writing is that our speaking is context dependent. That is, we use lots of words that refer to the particular context of situation that we're in. So if we use deictic terms like here, there, now, then we have to have the context to be able to understand them. So it's context dependent. Whereas writing, of course, is context reduced. We don't share a similar visual space together as we do in speaking. And that affects the way that when we begin to write, we have to take all that into consideration. Here's a very famous message which illustrates the difference between the two. It's a message from Lord Raglan at the Battle of Balaclava, and this would have been passed on from Lord Raglan to his generals, to the people who carried the messages. And this would have been a spoken message, maybe written down, but it was a spoken message. This is the message. Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Well, the problem with this particular message was that Lord Raglan was way, way up on the top of the hill, and below him he could see several valleys where there were different parts of this particular battle, the Battle of Balaclava. And the problem was that he was referring to one particular valley where there was a particular, where the enemy were. But unfortunately, the message got through to the Light Brigade, and the Light Brigade being such patriots that they took the order and they charged the Russian cannon. They were fighting the Russians. Well, of course, the order wasn't meant for them, and as you can see, if you read that message again, Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry, well, which cavalry? Do you mean the Light Brigade or some other brigade? To advance rapidly to the front. Which front? Follow the enemy. The enemy where? In this valley or another valley? And try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Which guns? Okay, so there were very different skirmishes going on in this battle. Unfortunately, the Light Brigade thought the message was for them, and of course it wasn't, and that's why they charged to their death. And a famous poem was written about it by Alfred Lord Tennyson afterwards, which immortalized their courage. But in fact, they were stupid because they got their message wrong. It wasn't intended for them. Or let's say Lord Raglan was equally as stupid, that he couldn't make his message clearer because he wasn't referring to the right context, or he didn't clarify it. Okay, so before we go on and look at some of the ways that speaking intersects with sport, let's just make one distinction here, which is very important. We can't really think of writing as speaking as being just different in those particular elements. They do, of course, differ in those elements, but what we notice is that there are ways in which writing can be like speaking, and there's ways that speaking can be like writing. And with that in mind, another kind of distinction we can make is plus literate and plus orate. Okay, and when we're talking about plus literate, we're talking about planned, something that's planned. So if you look at a lecture, which of course is spoken, it is hopefully highly planned, and in a sense it's planned in a similar way to a scientific article would be, which is written. So what we can say is that even though a lecture is spoken, it still conforms very much to the notion of something which is literate. Then you can contrast that with things which are orate and unplanned. So we know that conversation is spoken, and of course that's pretty unplanned. But also a letter or a tweet or an email or a text is usually pretty unplanned, even though it's written. So the distinction of literate meaning planned and orate meaning unplanned cuts across the spoken and written modes. Okay, let's have a look at sport announcer talk. Here's an article by Ferguson. Ferguson was one of the first to actually look at the register of sports announcer talk. So sports announcer talk is a particular way of speaking, and in linguistics we use the word register to refer to that particular style. And what Ferguson did was look at the formal features of sports announcer talk. So he came up with a list of particular formal differences as opposed to other kinds of talk. So firstly, simplification. There's a lot of pronoun dropping. So we don't say he hit 307, hit 307. and the dropping of the pronoun plus the copula. The copula is the verb to be. So instead of saying it's a fastball, the commentator would just say fastball, strike, 1-1. So we'll have lots of simplification, and notice we can do this, the announcers can do this because it's context dependent, right? You can see this also simplification with the actual deletion of the copula after a single word proper name at the beginning of a sentence. So we have a proper name like Klutz or Milburn or Makati. And instead of using the copula or the verb to be, we can just omit it. So Klutz, in close at third. Milburn, with good speed, at first. Makati, in difficulty. The A's, now hoping to get whatever is, etc. So those are more other examples of simplification. Another element is the use of inversion, which is very interesting here, and you can begin to see how this perhaps fits with the flow of a commentary. Holding up at third is Murphy, instead of Murphy is holding up at third. Perhaps it's done like this because it takes a little while to identify who actually is holding up at third. Over at third is Murphy. Tagging at third is Nettles to score. And all set again is Pat Heldon. And outright is Drew Hill. So these are all examples of inversion. We get a use of result expressions, either for or to. Joe Ross has caught it for a touchdown. He throws for the out. And he just keeps alive, reaching out to foul tip one back. And a fourth kind of formal distinction is what are called heavy modifiers. Modifiers are a series of adjectives that particularly qualify a particular noun. So if you look at the first one there, Warren Cromarty, now we have the modifier. It's pretty heavy because it's kind of long. The left-handed hitter swings. Eddie Yost, a crackerjack, who was not a power hitter. And his pretty long one here, David Winfield, the $25 million man who is hitting 0.56 in this World Series, etc. Steve Yeager, who won Sunday's game with the dramatic home run on the heels of Guerrero's shot. Yeager coming up. Okay, a fifth element, of course, is the use of the present tense in commentary. So Bert, ready, comes to Winfield, and it's line to the left, but Baker's there, and backhands a sinker, then throws it to Lopez. Okay, usually it's the present simple tense as you find there, but most of the choice of tenses in commentary, of course, is the present. Okay, so that's a paper by Ferguson, which gives a nice indication of the formal features of sports announcer talk. Let's have a look at a study which looks at the content of sports announcer talk. This is a study by Billings and Eastman. They work in the area of communications, and Billings and Eastman have done a lot of work looking at the kinds of content of sports announcer talk. This particular study looks at the 2000 Olympics in Sydney. And what they're particularly interested in is whether the embassy's coverage of the 2000 Sydney Olympics showed bias towards any gender, ethnicity, or nationality. So to do that, they examined 54 hours of NBC's primetime coverage of the 2000 Sydney Olympics. And these were their results. Let's just look at ethnicity and gender. So black athletes' success was characterized usually by their innate athletic skill and courage. So whenever the commentator's describing a black athlete, they tend to talk about success in terms of their innate athletic skill and courage. Whereas white athletes' success was characterized by their superior commitment, composure, concentration, and experience. The suggestion here is that these are particular stereotypes that are being used here, not consciously, but they tend to come out as stereotypes. And of course, in terms of the mention of athletes, it turns out that white athletes were mentioned way, way more times than black athletes. In terms of gender, we have similar kinds of stereotypical uh, ways of viewing the difference between males and females. So, for example, women athletes were viewed as having less athletic skill and less commitment to their sports than were men athletes. There were more comments about attractiveness for women than for men. Uh, Comments about strength were twice as frequent in regards to men than women. And in terms of clock time, more time was spent on men than more time was spent on women. So what we find is, and of course this has a huge influence upon people who are watching in a very unconscious way, because they're being presented with certain stereotypical ways of looking at athletes which tend to reflect larger stereotypical views based upon race and gender. Okay, so let's move on to another kind of speaking that happens a lot in sports, and that's trash talk or insult talk. So trash talk is a type of insult talk. Um, a, a lot of trash talk is derived from a very traditional African American insult game called the dozens, or playing the dozens, or sometimes called signifying, and it's kind of similar to roasting as well. And it's the source of all those your mama jokes, right? Because the idea in this particular game is to try and insult, to use your verbal dexterity to insult your opponent, but not resort to violence. Any contestant that eventually resorts to violence is deemed to have lost the game. It really is a game of verbal skill, and the verbal skill of creating the most colorful insults. Um, Trash talk is the word that's used in most sports. In certain sports, there are other terms used. For example, sledging in cricket and chirping in ice hockey. And you can find some examples of these in this folder uh, about this. The one about cricket, of course, is a more sedate form of trash talk than you will find in basketball, but it still is the same kind of thing. You're trying to psych out your opponent through talk, through insult talk. Um, Here's a study by Leconto and Roth, and what they did was, what their aim was to kind of a classification system of trash talk, the rules by which trash talk is used, and they also wanted to identify the context in which trash talk is used, and to come up with a rationale for trash talk. Um, are They used interviews, semi-structured, in-depth interviews. Semi-structured means they start with a few questions, but they have mainly open-ended questions and let the interview flow where the interviewee wants to take the interview. So they talked about 50 student athletes. And what they came up with, and what I'm going to look at here mainly, and I'm not going to look at the other particular aims of this research, is a set of rules. And it's interesting that this is a set of rules that characterize trash talk. Of course, nobody writes these down, but these appear to be the rules by which trash talk works. So do not take it off the field. Do not trash talk when losing. Don't talk about mamas or girlfriends. I don't know about that, but that's likely to inflame. Don't let the other team see trash talk get to you. Yeah, I guess that's important. Don't let trash talk get you thrown out of the game. Yeah, otherwise you've lost if you're thrown out of the game. Don't let trash talk result in a fight. Certainly not, because you're going to be penalized. The idea is to win the game through the aid of trash talk. Let the referee hear you complain about a person talking trash, right? So that keys the referee to be on the lookout for any particular trouble. In rough games, players encourage others to talk trash, right? Yeah, so your teammates might be trying to get you to talk trash too. Talk has to be creative to get attention, yes. And that's key to insult talk. It's key to what we saw about playing the dozens. It has to be creative. And if you make a good play, you have the right to talk trash or act trash. You have the right to strut and dance and all that stuff. So that's a very interesting set of rules. What do you think? Do you think that characterized trash talk in your experience? Um, Now let's have a look at motivational talk, and um, what I want to look at here is specifically the halftime motivational talk. I've got various in the movies folder. I've got clips from two movies I'd like you to have a look at. One from Friday Night Lights and one from Any Given Sunday. And so please have a look at them. What I've got here is a frequency count of the particular words that are used in both these speeches, and a frequency count is used in linguistics, in corpus linguistics. A corpus is a body of text to throw some insights into the way a particular speech event, like a motivational halftime talk, is structured. As you can see at the top there, Friday Night Lights, the speech is 280 words. It's about half the size of the Al Pacino Any Given Sunday speech. But you can get to see how the levels of people-centered as opposed to topic-centered these speeches are. So if you look at Friday Night Lights, we have 22 instances of the personal pronoun you, and then if you go down, 7 of the personal pronoun I. If you contrast that with Any Given Sunday, you'll see a whopping 21 examples of I and 17 of you. By the way, the percentages there also give you a better clue as to what's going on in the speech. And so 4.33% of the speech is made up with references to I. And if you contrast that with Friday Night Lights, the references to you are 7.6% of the speech. So you can see both these speeches are highly people-centered. And of course, fundamental difference is in Friday Night Lights, the particular focus is upon the audience, the hearer, whereas in Any Given Sunday, it's very ego-involved and it's Al Pacino. And when you watch the speech, you'll see that Al Pacino is talking about his own life and his own mistakes. For most of course, Friday Night Lights is focusing upon the hearer, the audience. Another way of looking at particular motivational talk, like a halftime speech, is to break it down in terms of content, in terms of types of message. So this is a neat study by Kassing and Pappas. They interviewed lots and lots of college athletes and asked them about the most memorable message their coaches used. And you might think about the memorable messages that your coaches used when you were in high school or now. And so they broke it down into these kinds of categories. Challenge your motivation. The only one who can tell you that you can't do something is you, and you don't have to listen. Life lessons. Every battle isn't worth fighting. Responsibility. Don't be sorry. Make it better. Physical toughness. Pain is temporary. Pride is forever. Regret and reflection. Play every game as if it's the most important game of the season. Work ethic and sacrifice. Perfect practice makes perfect. And then instruction, which refer to instructions about playing the particular game. Keep your elbows down, your hands in, and swing through. So those are a pretty useful set of categories. And you might want to look at the speeches in Friday Night Lights and Any Given Sunday and begin to use those categories to categorize the types of messages used in those speeches. Finally, let's have a look at self-talk. And self-talk is the way that athletes, well, in fact, most of us talk to ourselves. We might not actually verbalize it so much, but it's a sub-verbalization. But we're conscious of a particular dialogue going on inside of us. Um, so this is a notion taken from the linguist Bakhtin, and we've already met Bakhtin as before. He's the person who gave us the concept of the not the burlesque, the carnivalesque, which is key to understanding the use of chants at sports events. Um, so it's a type of argumentative dialogue between two or more voices, not people, within an athlete's consciousness. These voices represent different opinions, beliefs, and points of view. And it's usually a type of self-talk in which two or more voices within the consciousness of one athlete are engaged in a debate. And here's a little example. We'll see the bigger one later. Voice one, you pathetic wimp. You should be running stronger. Voice two, stay steady. This pace was your plan today. So in a sense, we get these two voices, the kind of the negative voice and the positive voice. And this is taken from a study by Tavares, and she interviewed lots and lots of athletes, and she got some examples of self-talk. Here's one from swimming. So Liz is talking about the voices in her. Yeah, quickly, yeah. You have one that's like high-pitched voice. Come on, just stop. If you stop right now, it's just a game. This whole thing is just a game. You could fucking stop right now. It's not a big deal. And then you have this other voice that is like deep, raspy voice. No, fuck you. You've been training all year for this. And then she continues with the high-pitched voice and then the deep, raspy voice. Okay, so one is positive, one tends to be negative. And it's interesting that she got other examples from other sports. This one's from running. And in this one, the particular athlete was able to give names to the voices. One's called the pisser and one's called the rock. So after the first 20 miles or so, my body started to rebel. The conversation in my head went something like this. The pisser. You pathetic wimp. You should be running stronger. Get it together. The rock. Stay steady. This pace was your plan today. Just get through the miles and you'll be fine. The pisser. You're getting your arse kicked. Pick it up. What is your problem anyway? The rock. Don't focus on the other runners. Just do what you need to take care of you. Look at the scenery and enjoy yourself. The pisser. Screw the scenery, you suck. You think you're an athlete? Get over it yourself. And so this seems to be very common amongst athletes. And one of the readings is taken from Tony Cascarina. He's a soccer player, played for Ireland. And you can read parts of his particular autobiography where he very often uses this internal polemic, these two voices which run through his head before and during games. Okay, so what we've done here is we've looked at speaking and we've contrasted it with writing and noticed certain features which are different. And then we looked at 4 different elements of speaking within the context of sport. We looked at sport or sports announcer talk. We looked at trash talk or insult talk. We looked at motivational talk, the talk that's used by coaches. And then we looked at self-talk, the talk that's used by athletes to motivate themselves or not motivate themselves.